Welcome back. We are joined today by Scott Ritter, a former UN weapons inspector, a US Marine Corps intelligence officer, and a prolific author. So thank you very much for coming on the program. We appear to be entering very dangerous times. That is, the attacks on Russia are now intensifying. We saw massive drone attacks on Moscow over the weekend, and before we logged on now, I saw that drones were also entering the space around St. Petersburg, very far away from Ukraine, I would add, to the extent they had to shut down many of the flights going out of Pulkovo. To what extent is the West involved in these attacks?
Let's make it absolutely clear, if it wasn't for Western involvement, these attacks would not be taking place.
Exactly.
The technologies being used are developed by the West for Ukraine. The intelligence information is provided exclusively by the West for Ukraine. The manufacturing is done outside of Ukraine to avoid Russian interdiction. Again, this is not an example of Ukraine escalating against Russia. This is the collective West escalating against Russia. This is, a reflection of the reality that NATO is actively engaged, or NATO nations are actively engaged in combat operations against Russia. That is basically, achieving, an existential threat to the, survival of Russia.
Well, let's see, in Europe, there's a lot of talk about the need to bring the war to Russia. There's a lot of talk about mass producing long-range weapons to strike Russia. I guess, when did they cross the point when for Russia to do nothing is more dangerous than hitting back, I guess, because we seem to be crossing this, well, if we haven't.
We've crossed it now. Right now, if Russia allows the status quo to continue, which is a whole bunch of factories across Europe making drones, sending them to Ukraine, then sending them deep into Russia, they allow that to continue, eventually the Russian economy will crumble. Like, all critical infrastructure will be hit. You just can't stop thousands and thousands of drones. Unless Russia can strike those factories in Europe and shut down production, Russia will fall. So they have to. There is no choice at this point.
Haven't already, we would cross it fairly soon, it seems.
No, it's been crossed a long time ago. You have major Western nations, Germany, France, Great Britain, and others openly articulating the necessity to engage Russia in open armed conflict by the end of this decade, 2029, 2030. We now have Pistorius, the defense minister of Germany, openly saying that Russia is our enemy and we need to prepare to go to war. And now they're preparing the weapons of war, specifically to conduct long-range strike missions inside Russia. So, I mean, I'm not a Russian leader, and there's a good reason why I'm not. A, I'm American, and B, you wouldn't want me to be your leader because we'd be at war with Europe right now. I'd be launching preemptive strikes. I'd be taking out production facilities. I'd be destroying decision-making centers, and I'd be implementing in full effect the Karaganov doctrine.
I would too, actually. I do understand Putin delaying that while he goes to China. That I do understand. But once he gets back, oh my God, I think hell is going to break loose. I mean, if a factory in Europe is making drones that's going to be shot deep into Russia's strategic depth, then, yeah, I send a Rishnik and poof, that factory goes bye-bye.
Well, it appears though that it's very strange if you listen to the rhetoric 4 years ago, the caution and something that sounded like...
It was on this guy's show, Glenn Dyesen, that the Russian first articulated the new thinking in Moscow that we need to just hit them, and then if they try to hit us back, we nuke them. And some countries in Europe should cease to exist. That the new Russian thinking. They're angry. It's a scary situation.
Rational arguments and concern about being participants in the war,
and what's so scary on top of it all is Trump, because I can't trust him at all on anything international relations, even domestic now with him turning on Massey. I don't know if I can trust him there either. So, yeah, I'm still glad it's him rather than Kamala Harris by a tiny margin, but please don't fail my expectations even more, Trump, or I might actually get to the point same as Tucker Carlson and thinking, oh, maybe Kamala Harris would have been better.
Rhetoric now, yes, we're far apart. But a lot of these attacks on Russia now they very evidently so has gone through the Baltic states. Then we're seeing especially Estonia and Latvia. Of course, they have to transit through Lithuania as well if this is going to work. But we also heard that some statements from the Russian foreign intelligence services.
Another thing if they've started making threats of attacking Kaliningrad. You see this little chunk right here? That's Russia. This is Lithuania. This is Belarus and Poland. So Belarus is sort of Russia. It's Russia's ally. They are military together. But this Kaliningrad is disconnected from the Russian mainland. And now Lithuania is saying we need to invade Kaliningrad. Like the NATO needs to take out Kaliningrad. There's those in Europe making that argument now. Provocative.
Is arguing that Ukraine is preparing strikes on Russia from Latvian territory. I mean, once the Russians make these statements, aren't they committed?
Oh, and you remember how I talked about how it was suspected that Ukraine was launching strikes, their drones from here? Now there's like confirmation that that's what they're going to doing. That's where they're preparing. They're preparing more strikes from Latvia here, so they can strike deep up into Russia. Like Ukraine's way down here. Belarus is an adversary. They can't shoot their drones through Belarus. Well, they can, but Belarus would shoot them down, same as in Russia. So shooting drones all the way through Russia and Belarus and reaching all the way up here without them being shot down is virtually impossible. So now they're going to launch them from here through Estonia airspace and like that. This is the only section that Russia has time to react before they like hit St. Petersburg. You know, St. Petersburg, hugely important city for Russia. Well, now they're going to target them through Latvia. Huge provocation. Russia can't allow that.
Committing to something? Because if they say we know...
Because if Russia allows that, you know what's going to happen? Now they're going to start launching Russian drones from Finland into Russia. And there's no reason... Yeah, and then they're going to hit stuff way up here that's farther from Ukraine than it could ever hope to hit. No, if they don't, that's why conflict is guaranteed to expand in Europe right now, is that if this is enough, if shooting drones from here is enough, then they'll start doing it from Finland too. I mean, they're at the point where they will, every time Russia doesn't respond, they'll escalate one level further. And either Russia gets destroyed or it retaliates.
It's happening from Latvia, but we're not going to do anything. It seems that this will become an impossibility.
Well, yes, I think it's gone beyond the concept of a possibility to a probability, and maybe even an absolute certainty. I think Latvia is being marked for death. I don't believe Russia. Again, I don't pretend to know anything about the. I do know.
He makes a good point. I agree that they're going to make an example out of someone, and I think what he's saying is Latvia is the one that they're reportedly going to launch Ukrainian drones from. Yep, it would make the biggest, most likely target.
Sergei Karaganov, you know Sergei Karaganov, and you know that he's a serious man. He's a rational actor. He's not an irrational actor, and he's somebody whose voice has influence. And you know, Sergei Karaganov.
Yeah, the technocrats want Europe to burn before being ousted. Yep, exactly. And also, they want to use. Look how unpopular Starmer is. Look at how unpopular Macron is. You know, war, wag the dog. A war, they can use that to... Starmer, for example, if there was war, you know, however it's talked about, he's finished as prime minister, he could use that as an excuse to not give up his premiership. Just to throw that out as an example. It's there's that angle too. It's escalate, and if Russia does something big in response, they can say, oh, it was unprovoked, look at this, we need to all rally behind me, Starmer, so we can fight Russia.
And other.
I don't think it'll work, by the way. I think it'll work, be far less effective than they're thinking. People of Europe don't want to fight Russia.
There's like him who advise or whose opinions are heeded by the Ministry of Defense and the Russian leadership, you know, have articulated a very sound, rational case for Russian military intervention, decisive. I don't believe these people who speak of Russian military intervention are playing the game of managed escalation. I think we're beyond that. The reason why we're where we're at, and I don't blame Vladimir Putin, he was a genius, and he still is a genius. He has been managing the escalation ladder in perfect form, because never once prior to this most recent era in this war did Ukraine pose an existential threat to the security of Russia. It was always the potential, but we know that the West has been articulating in favor of the strategic defeat of Russia since the beginning of the special military operation. We know this. And we know that they
Yeah, the end goal was to collapse of the Russian government, balkanization of Russia, like cut it up into, like, these three little countries didn't exist before the Soviet Union collapsed. They just cut it up, Soviet Union, into smaller pieces, chunks, so that it'd be more manageable. They want to do that to all of Russia. They just cut it up into like 10 different little countries, which the United States can then bully around. United States from Europe can bully around and loot. Just all the natural resources go in, and U.S., European companies can just loot the country.
have been pushing Russia, pushing Russia, pushing Russia. Russia sets a red line, it gets crossed. Russia resets the red line, it gets crossed. Now Russia, resets it for a reason, because the crossing of the red line, was designed, was done by design to get a Russian overreaction, so that the West could mobilize support and solidify support on behalf of Ukraine. It was Russia's goal and objective to keep the West, from being able to do that. So you don't overreact. You allow the red lines to be crossed, because at the end of the day, it didn't change the ultimate calculation. Russia still prevailed on the battlefield. Well, Russia's still prevailing on the battlefield today. The Special Inspector General of Operation Atlantic Resolve has published a report recently that says Russia's dominated across the battlefield. So all those pro-Ukrainian social media platforms just stick it in your ear. The United States has spoken. And even that report, is very conservative in terms of, giving a lot of credit to Ukraine and NATO that simply isn't reflected by reality. But their conclusions are Russia maintains operational strategic dominance across the spectrum of this conflict. And that's what Russia has been seeking to do, to wear not just Ukraine down, but the collective West down through a war of attrition.
And it has. One reason the situation was so bad in the Iran war is because so many air defenses were sent to Ukraine, and so many interceptor missiles. And so the stocks were low going into the Iran war. And then Iran depleted them further to the point where they ran out in a lot of places. If Russia hadn't done that Russia helped. The biggest way, that's the biggest way Russia helped Iran, is by depleting the air defenses of the collective West. And then they made all of Iran's ballistic missiles that much more effective. And it's not just the air defenses. Tanks, ammunition, mortar shells, everything's being depleted in the West, and everything's being sent to Ukraine, where it's just either blown up by Russians before it reaches front lines, or then used. And Europe has never been weaker. Without the United States, Russia crushes Europe. With the United States, then it becomes a very messy conflict. If the United States went all in fighting, it gave up on Iran and went all in on fighting Russia, then yes, Russia would it would be in for a tough fight in that scenario. But without the United States, Europe gets crushed.
And they're still succeeding. But what's happened is, because Russia has allowed the collective West to cross red lines, they've crossed the ultimate red line.
I'm assuming, of course, nukes aren't used. If nukes are used, everyone loses. But if nukes are off the table, in terms of all other weapons, Russia crushes Europe.
Right. Because in the past, you always, as you said, the West always went, we want to avoid being able to be categorized as an active participant in the conflict. We always wanted to create that air of ambiguity. Well, there's no more ambiguity. They're just straight up doing it, straight up saying it. And now we come to Sergei Karaganov. We probably should do a good job of introducing him to a Western audience. This is one of the premier political military analysts in Russia, a man who has advised Russian presidents from Boris Yeltsin to Vladimir Putin. In 2023, he articulated in writing and spoken word the need for the West to be decisively countered by Russia. He was in favor of the preemptive use of nuclear weapons, that when the West articulates a strategy calling for the strategic defeat of Russia, Russia has a duty and responsibility to respond and nip this in the bud before it manifests itself in something that does real harm to Russia. And he famously said that his calculation is that no American leader will trade Boston for Poznan, meaning Russia could just take out a Polish city with a nuclear weapon, and Europe will do nothing. It'll intimidate Europe, and the United States will do nothing because they don't want to trade Boston for Poznan. Vladimir Putin.
I think he's right. I think that thinking is right. I don't want Poland to get nuked, but if Poland was nuked, the United States isn't going to do thermonuclear war for Poland.
Came out immediately and said, I don't agree with Sergei Karaganov. That's not who we are. That's not what we do. In 2024.
Okay, I'll have a look. It's on Discord, I imagine. Let's see. Oh, I need to open Discord. I have restarted my computer. Oh, yeah, I see. Federal minimum gold prices. Okay. Well, I'll have a look at that in more detail after I finish this video. But I see the graph. If you want, I can show you some of them, all my old charts. I've got folders full of them.
As the West continued to push, he appointed Sergei Karganov to be the head of the review process for the Kremlin Strategic Nuclear Posture Review. In 2025, the Russians published a new strategic nuclear posture that basically was the Karganov doctrine, basically saying that if nuclear powers provide conventional military capability to a non-nuclear power and use that to strike into the strategic depth of Russia that threatens Russia's strategic infrastructure, that Russia is therefore empowered to use nuclear weapons in response.
All right, I'll do that. I should. I could make Discord channel. I'll put all my old stuff there. Yep.
They can treat this as a nuclear attack. That's exactly what's happening. People need to understand that this doctrine was published last year. It was covered. We talked about it. Everybody talked about it. Everybody knew this. And yet the West is doing something now that is just flagrantly crosses that red line because they believe Russia is bluffing. And so now they've crossed the red line, and Ukraine is doubling down because Ukraine smells blood. Ukraine is dying. And for the first time, Ukraine's going, wait a minute, we're doing real harm here.
Yes, they are doing real harm for the first time.
Let's keep doing it. Let's keep doing it because they want NATO to become engaged. That's their goal. That's their salvation. And so Ukraine is just doubling down, throwing caution to the wind. In a week and a half time, the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum opens up. This is like the premier, thing. It's bigger than Davos. So everybody in the West knows Davos. St. Petersburg International Economic Forum swamps it. It's bigger, more participants, more money, more everything. You think the Russians are going to let Ukrainian drones come out of the Baltics and threaten this? You think that's going to happen? You think they're going to let this happen? No, not at all.
And timing works for that. Putin will be back from China by then. And so before the St. Petersburg Forum, you might see that retaliation from Russia.
I see nothing but bad things, bad tidings. I think the West has gone too far. I think there will be hell to pay. I don't know if Russia limits it to Latvia. If I were the Russians, I wouldn't. I would take out the production facilities in England, in Germany, in Denmark, all identified production facilities associated with the FP5 and other drones. I would take out German companies involved in guidance and control, and I would even take out Ramstein. Maybe not. Maybe that's an American base, but I would threaten to take out Ramstein and follow-on attack, where the intelligence is gathered and disseminated. But the West has to be struck a blow, and I would eliminate Kiev once and for all. I think it's time to find out what a dozen Oreshniks can do to downtown Kiev. And I think it's time to show the Ukrainians that that's the fate of all of your cities if you want to continue this war. Russia, Vladimir Putin said on May 9th that he wants this war to wrap up. A lot of people went, oh, that's a sign of Russian weakness. Russia's willing. No, it's a sign of Russian recognition of their strength, and it's time to flex their muscles. The day of restraint, I believe, is over. I believe we're moving to a very dangerous period because now we get to answer the question, what will the United States do when Russia strikes a NATO country? How will Article 5 be treated?
Yeah. What will NATO do when Russia attacks?
Yeah, I spoke to Karaganov last week, and he, on this program, and he was making the point that in the past he was representing a small minority who said it's time to retaliate directly against the Europeans. But now he says he represents the overwhelming majority. So you already had all this pressure building up on the Kremlin that, they had to choose a different path, this dilemma. Do they retaliate against NATO and risk going up the escalation ladder, or did they look the other way and again risk emboldening NATO? That they always went with the second option, but now the pressure was mounting so much, and just at this point when all this pressure is mounting on Putin to take a harder line, we see these massive drone attacks and just uncontrolled celebrations in Europe. And this is what's...
Yeah, there's some places in Europe that have already been conquered by migrants. It's no longer the continent I remember. It's changed so much. It's sad. Went back to Switzerland recently, and there's graffiti all over the place. It didn't used to be that way.
Yeah, so concerning. It's as if they don't see what's coming next. I mean, they use all these terms like, because bad for Russia, they think is good for us. Before you use this term that, the people online, the pro-Ukrainian bloggers or social media activists, it's not even pro-Ukrainian. These are the if Ukraine had implemented the Minsk agreement, done anything like this, which they always opposed, Ukraine will be intact now. This is these people are destroying Ukraine. It's quite insane. But my concern is what the Europeans are celebrating now, which is that they're having the attacks on Russia is having a growing impact on Russian security. And they seem to be making a significant dent in the Russian energy. Again, I'm not sure how much, but at least it seems to be enough to create problems for the Russians. And if this is the case, that means...
Yeah, especially port facility on the Black Sea that Ukraine hit 4 days in a row. They mostly destroyed this one critical oil infrastructure. And they've struck the ports up here through the Baltic states, and these strikes add up. Yes, some parts of the oil facility, if they get hit by a drone, they could be repaired. But if you have that happening all over Russia, the parts to repair, the people available to repair, is not unlimited. The repairs can't keep up, and then you get real problems.
Means the Russians can't afford to look the other way anymore. I don't know, how are you assessing the attacks on the Russian energy security or energy? Because, I mean, this is the irony. We should be happy that we weren't making a dent. Once we start making a dent, the calculations they have to change, don't they, on the Russian side?
Look, last November, I was in Moscow and I interviewed somebody affiliated with the Russian Duma, State Duma, involved in the committee on the protection of energy infrastructure from drone attacks. I'm sure it had a more Russian name than that, but he was on it, and I was surprised by the frankness of his conversation. I actually published it on the Russia House. I think many people ignored it at the time because it's people don't like to dig deep into fact-based reality. They like to live in their little fantasy worlds.
Yeah, all the reporting I'd heard over the last few years is that last year there were attacks on Russian energy infrastructure, but all of them, they were pinpricks, easily repairable, and no noticeable effect overall. That was last year. This year is different.
I'm going to republish it and ask people to listen to it because it's important what he said at the time. He said that these attacks were taking place, but that the real damage done was minimal, that Russia was able to mitigate the damage and then repair the facilities and bring them back into order. So, the strategic impact was not, which is why, again, it's not that Karaganov's arguments became, again, I don't believe Vladimir Putin responds to pressure from Sergei Karaganov or anybody else. That's not how the game plays. And I don't think Sergei Karaganov is promoting himself as a man who has intimidated Putin into changing his mind.
No,
Sergei Karaganov has taken.
No, he never claimed that. He just claimed that his view was we should do this. And now, because the situation has changed, a lot of people have come over to the extreme view that, we need to strike Europe hard.
Taken a stance. And Vladimir Putin has said, no, the damage being done doesn't rate an overreaction. But now the damage equation has changed. It's not that Sergei Karaganov's arguments, that Putin's been pressured. Putin's a pragmatic guy, and he's looking at it. The damage being done now to Ukrainian energy infrastructure is real. And it's not easily mitigated. It's not easily repaired, meaning that when you do this damage, it's long-term. And Russia can't afford long-term damage. Again, there's things that happen in Russia that we're not aware of. And, I believe Russia, the idea that Russia operates on the margins is absurd. I believe Russia probably has strategic reserves just like everybody else. And I believe that they're able to ride this out because you see a lot of people talking about Russia's, export volumes having dropped significantly. But the potential for, the production of,
they've been hurt so far, but it's not something that's critical so far. What is, if Ukraine kept the drone attacks at this level for another year, yes, then it would be catastrophic for Russia. But so far, it hasn't been yet.
Refined product for export is being impacted. At some point in time, the reserves run out, and if you haven't brought this potential back up, you're going to have a gap, and it's going to be meaningful. It's not Vladimir Putin's job to allow Russia to get to the point where you have meaningful impact. His job is to prevent that from happening. So, this is my way of answering your question. I believe that between 10 and 20% of Russia's export production capacity has been damaged to an extent beyond that which it was being impacted in November. That this damage will take months to repair. And that if Russia doesn't nip this in the bud now, by the time they repair it and bring it back online, the reserves that are currently carrying them through this process will be depleted. And then you're going to have a real and significant impact. And that's why Russia needs to act now. And I also think that the Ukrainians become more and more emboldened.
If Russia doesn't react, it won't be long before Finland starts launching drones too.
We know what the consequences of an attack on the Kremlin will be. Fatal for everybody. But if you're a Russian, you don't want the Kremlin attacked. You don't want to wait for that to happen. You see the Ukrainians moving in that direction. This is the direction they are heading. It's inevitable. You see the West backing up. You see the rhetoric, and the damage is being done. This is the moment of decision right now.
To hit the Kremlin, you just need to ramp up production of drones a little bit more and stockpile enough so that you have like 4,000, and just send them in wave after wave as fast as you can. And some of them will get through because it's just overwhelming air defenses. No air defense, no matter how advanced, if you overload it, it won't hold out endlessly. So if Russia does nothing, Kremlin will be struck eventually.
Now, if you wait, you allow the Ukrainians to do significant, meaningful harm of an existential nature. Right now, Russia has the capacity to absorb, repair, and move on if the threat can be terminated. So now is the moment of decisive action. And I
To put it a different way, all the damage so far, let's say all Russian technicians are busy repairing it. If anything more is damaged, there are no technicians to repair that additional damage, for example. So we've reached a point where further damage is critical, would really harm Russia.
again, I don't want to speak on behalf of anybody. It's just assessments, and as we all know, assessments can be wrong. But I have to say, on May 9th, the whole scene around Victory Day was. I mean, look, you're a specialist. You lived in Russia. You know the Russians. This was a different May 9th than I've seen in the last 4 years since the special military operation began. This was a May 9th of deathly seriousness. At the embassy, the ambassador spoke incessantly about unconditional surrender, unconditional surrender, unconditional surrender, linking Nazi Germany and the Ukrainian government in a way that had never been done before. They spoke of Germany as a permanent enemy, not as a former enemy that Germany is the enemy today, is the enemy. This was the language. Dmitry Medvedev, who has always been sort of the bad, crazy cop to Putin's good, sane cop, wrote an article in RT. What's the importance of RT? RT English. It's an article written for the West to read.
Yep. I've gotten a lot of news from the RT. It covers stories that Western propaganda outlets don't.
It's designed for Western consumption, but it's an article that speaks with the force of the.
You can somewhat trust RT on topics that don't have to do with Russia. Don't trust RT for corruption stories in Russia, but other things, it can be good.
Russian government. This is Russian state media. This isn't Medvedev putting a social media post out on X. This is RT, Russian state media, publishing a major article written by a man who used to be the president of Russia, used to be the prime minister of Russia, and currently is number 2 on the National Security Council. And the article is devastating for Europe. It pretty much endorses the Karaganov diet. Karaganov, the day before, had another interview that basically hammered home the same points.
I agree with read RT for U.S. news and other countries, but read our media for Russian news. No, if you're reading our media, you're not hearing that Russia is getting ready to nuke Europe. You're not hearing that in our media. I don't trust our media for anything. YouTube, get your news about Russia from YouTube, from like Glenn Deason and other respectable sources. Never trust mainstream.
The sense I get in having watched Russia, monitored Russia, et cetera, is that Russia has reached the point of decision. And unless something fundamentally changes, such as the unconditional surrender of Ukraine today, I think we're going to see decisive action before the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum begins to preempt any potential attack.
So we have a time frame. After Putin's China trip ends and before the St. Petersburg Economic Forum begins, that will be when Russia will probably lash out at Europe.
I'd be curious to be a fly on the wall, although that's an insult to the Chinese. I'm sure their sanitation is such that there are no flies on the wall. But I'd be curious to be a fly on the wall in the conversations between Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping about this, because China was extraordinarily tough on Trump about Taiwan. And the Chinese know that Ukraine is as important to Russia as Taiwan is to China. And so, the Financial Times playing their MI6 stupid mind games, putting out this stuff about how Xi Jinping told Trump that Putin overstepped. Hey, just the simplistic stupidity of this. Andrei Ilnitsky, former lieutenant general advisor to Shoigu when he was Minister of Defense, and the author of the concept of mental warfare. This isn't mental warfare. Mental warfare is actually carefully crafted, designed to get in there, latch in, and rip. What the British did here was just crude and stupid, and you could immediately see all the corrupted social media outlets that immediately jump on and say, aha, aha. I mean,
another video, the commentator lives in China, and he was saying, he mentioned this topic that Xi had said to Putin, do you regret invading Ukraine? They laughed. Everyone laughed. The Chinese businessmen, they all know it's nonsense.
Brain dead people. No, that's not the case at all. But I do believe that this is a very important meeting, and that, look, Russia needs China. There's no doubt about that. Russia needs China, and China needs Russia. And there's no
Yeah, China needs Russia too. All the resources, like with U.S. trying to go after Iran and oil from the Middle East, it just makes sense to bring Russia oil from Russia to China in a way that the United States and the West can do nothing about. It's they're connected. They're right next to each other. An alliance between Russia and China just makes sense.
doubt in my mind that this meeting may go down in history as sort of the modern day version or the present day version of the February 4th, 2022 meeting, where Vladimir Putin flew to China, to Beijing, met with Xi Jinping on the eve of the initiation of the special military operation. I have a feeling that there will be conversations had that at least allow the Chinese to be positioned for about for what is about to happen.
That's what I was thinking as well, because, well, Trump just left and Putin has arrived in Beijing. And I'm assuming if the Russians are now planning to, well, dramatically change their posture in this war, that they would discuss this at length with the Chinese first. So I'm assuming as well that this is something they're discussing because, again, there is no status quo which they can hold on to. It's not just where they are today, the drone attacks, but the Russians can see exactly what direction this is going. The Chinese can see this. So I think the hatred of Russia in Europe has blinded them completely to what will come next. This is so predictable, the war we're walking into, and yet nothing, no debate, no discussion, no dissent, not a squeak. It's...
Yeah, he's talking on Europe's part. Yes, there's no debate. Europe is provoking a war with Russia without even informing their people about it. And as people like Asmongold will be like shocked when Russia attacks it, like, why did they do this? Without understanding anything.
It's extraordinary. This must be most ridiculous world war we're walking into here. But I did want to get your thought on something, though. That is, the defense minister in Latvia resigned after I think the Ukrainian drones were scrambled and they hit some targets within Latvia. What do you make of this situation?
Yeah, it's hard to know unless you have access to the totality of information. I think what happened is there's embarrassment. There can be no doubt that there's stupid games played all the time. And plausible deniability is the coin of the realm when it comes to the official face of governance. But militaries and intelligence services oftentimes engage in covert relationships that are deniable or are supposed to be deniable. I think they got caught with their pants down, and it's an embarrassing situation. And so he paid the price. He was relieved of his position, but the policy is not changing. And again, we don't know the details. They're saying that these are drones that are redirected by the Russians using electronic warfare. The Russians are saying that these drones were in the airspace. I think people have been tracking the drones and they see there's a definite Baltic corridor. So that's not an invention. That's not imagination. Whether the Russians were clever enough to take control of drones and target Baltic oil production is another thing. But again, if the Ukrainians weren't using a Baltic corridor, then the Russians wouldn't have to do this. But I think what we're seeing here is that...
what he's talking about is Ukrainians were bombing northern Russia by sending their drones up through the Baltic states. And what Russia did, this was an act of war for NATO to let its airspace be used like that, just mentioning it. But what Russia did is it took control of the drones and then sent them against targets in Latvia or Lithuania, I forget which one. And I think that was very effective. It shut down the use of Ukrainian drones in this area for a while. Of course, now Latvia is talking about sending them directly from their own country. So it was only a pause to the escalation. But it was pretty effective strategy to Ukraine shoots up drones this way. Russia takes control of them and redirects them towards oil infrastructure here.
There are political ramifications for being caught in failed covert policy.
Well, when the Russian Baltic coast was struck, the main argument was, they didn't use the Baltic airspace. This is Russian propaganda. But now we kind of turn the page on this because now they're saying, well, yes, they admitted that the Ukrainian drones over Estonia, Ukrainian drones over over Latvia, again, unavoidably so. Then also the Russian drones over Lithuania. So they're recognizing now that they are using this corridor. But it appears that the new narrative is that we haven't permitted it and we oppose it. But again, it doesn't make any sense to me.
Just as was the case when the CIA...
You let drones with explosives on them fly through your territory without shooting them down and just trusting that Ukraine is going to just attack Russia. No, you're participated to the war. if another country shoots missiles, drones over your territory, unless you have an agreement with them and you're on the same page and you're not ally of them, the cautious thing, the proper thing is to shoot down these weapons of death that are flying in your airspace.
I helped the Ukrainians try to attack Vladimir Putin in December of 2025 during his famous phone call with Donald Trump. You know, drones are brought down intact, and the guidance package is recovered intact. And Russian intelligence is able to extract data that proves everything about the targeting. And when the Ukrainians launched the amount of drones, yes, the Russians are shooting down a lot of drones, but we know that electronic warfare, for instance, let's take, if the Russians can take a drone and redirect it to a target, they can take a drone and land it. And there's no doubt in my mind that the Russians have recovered intact a number of these drones and have reverse engineered.
There was videos of them doing this over Russia.
The guidance, and they understand exactly the path flown by the drones. And they also, by evaluating the data, can tell where the data came from, what intelligence sources were used, et cetera. So I believe the Russians have a very, very full picture of what's going on, which is why when Narishkin publishes very pointed intelligence, I think we have to respect the fact that it's probably fact-based, not just rumor, speculation, or disinformation.
Well, just as they couldn't get more reckless. So we see that out of Lithuania, they're making the comments that we should now put more pressure on the fortress Kaliningrad. And this is again the Kaliningrad, the enclave. It has it's stuck, and severed from the rest of the Russian Federation. But this still hosts a million Russian civilians. They also host
Kaliningrad. That is, like what we said, this little area right here that's cut off from the rest of Russia. But this is part of Russia.
Nuclear weapons. But earlier on we had well, it's been a while now, but the U.S. General Donahue making the point that we can take Kaliningrad. All of this rhetoric is essentially about attacking Russia. I mean, how do you make sense of this? Because this is happening at the same time as the British now are trying to lead this naval group to confront the Russians. And I think it's quite predictable that they want to, if not put a full blockade, at least harass Russian ships in the Baltic Sea. So we see the escalation at every level. Do you see Kaliningrad possibly being a flashpoint? Or, I mean, there's so many possible flashpoints now, I guess.
I mean, it could be, because we're talking about insanity. I publicly...
If Russia doesn't respond, the escalation will just keep on endlessly. And yeah, who knows? Maybe NATO invades Kaliningrad first.
I cautioned General Donahue, not that he would listen to me, but I said the quickest way to ensure that you end up being marked with a stone at Arlington, your body won't be recovered, but there'll be a stone at Arlington, is to attack Kaliningrad, because the Russians will instantly kill you, your command staff, and everybody affiliated with this attack. It's just stupid. The Estonians making similar things, Latvians threatening. I tell you, the quickest way to make Kaliningrad not an enclave is to attack Kaliningrad, because we're going to see the Baltics become Russian again, and they'll become Russian overnight. That's just the reality of it. If that's the game they want to play, Russia doesn't want to do this, but Russia's not going to yield on this point. And if it does become
you see, if the Baltic states become Russia again, this becomes whole. You don't have this vulnerable little island out here. And so, yeah, the fastest way to make this Russia again is to attack Kaliningrad.
Flashpoint is a flashpoint that marks the total eradication of the Baltic states, which will be interesting, because then what will NATO do? Nothing. They can do nothing. The Baltics have always been this exposed appendage that, is Sweden now going to commit suicide, come in and save the Baltics? The Finns are going to make an attack on the Kola Peninsula and Vyborg to save the Baltics? No, because that would be the end of Finland, and that would be the end of Sweden. These nations joined a failing military alliance that has no political viability and zero military capacity to meaningfully project power.
And not only that, at the beginning of this operation, when the Ukraine war started, NATO did have impressive military reserves still of tanks and ammunition and whatnot, but that's all been depleted throughout this war in Ukraine. Everything's been sent to Ukraine, and then Russia's blown it up. There's graveyards of tanks in Ukraine, of Western tanks sent over there. We just wasted so many weapons that way. And so, yeah, it's right today, yes, absolutely a failing alliance, especially with the Iran war having drastically weakened the United States by depleting its ammunition.
Power. I just don't understand where is the commander of, NATO forces?
Trooper
Telling them,
1,234,567.
Agreed. Unlike Ukraine, the Baltics will be crushed within days against Russia. You have to understand, Ukraine had been preparing since 2014, when there was the confrontation between the separatists in the Donbass and the Ukrainians. Ukraine lost, basically, and there was a Minsk agreement that was never really implemented. And what the Ukraine did is just built up this fortification row using the towns in this area. And they built that up over 8 years. It was their army had been trained for 8 years for this confrontation with the Donbass and with Russia. It's a completely different scenario. The Baltic states haven't been preparing for 8 years for confrontation with Russia. They're not ready for it at all. It's, yes, they would be crushed.
military council to tell the yappy Baltic poodles or chihuahuas to shut up. I mean,
nice to see you here, Trucker 1234567.
because the rhetoric is fatal to NATO. If you want to have NATO totally collapse, show that Article 5 is absolutely meaningless. And the best way to show that Article 5 is absolutely meaningless is to provoke the Russians. What does the British fleet think they're going to do besides sink? I mean, it's stunning.
Yeah, go watch the video on YouTube, The Shocking State of the British Navy, and you'll understand what he's talking about. They're a joke. They're such a joke that someone went and created a YouTube video on how pathetic the British Navy is.
They all believe Russia's bluffing. They all believe Russia's bluffing. I mean, and they misunderstand patience and pragmatism for weakness.
Yeah, no, I also heard the talks that, Medvedev's putting on a show, same as Karaganov that is just putting on a show. They really respect they're really deterred by NATO. But, I don't think this is all for show as well. I've been in Karaganov's office just one-on-one before 2022 when he made the point as well that he doesn't believe that, as you said before, that the US would risk New York for Tallinn or something. So it's not going to happen. So I think this overconfidence that the Russians can be deterred, that they wouldn't dare. I think that they were cautious because it would be a reckless thing to attack a NATO country. But they kind of put the Russians in a position where it's even more reckless not to do anything. And, the idea you mentioned now that the Russians could take the Baltic states, I'm thinking a little bit about George Kennan. He gave this interview with the New York Times back in '98 when he made the point that, all the NATO, people pushing for NATO.
Another reason Ukraine is, why is because Ukraine is so damn big and they were able to effectively use guerrilla warfare until support from the West came. There is that, but there is also another betrayal. If you read commentators, is there was the reason like Russia retreated from Kiev is that they had reached an agreement. The rush to Kiev that Russia did, that was to pressure Ukraine into a deal, but then Boris Johnson came and killed that deal. And so it was just another in a long line of betrayals, like the Minsk agreement that was never implemented, another betrayal. In 2014, that war that happened between the Russian-backed separatists and Ukraine, the separatists won. And they sued for peace and did the Minsk agreement, and then the West backed out of those. Everything about Ukraine is one long list of betrayals from the West towards Russia.
NATO expansionism. At some point, the Russians are going to have to push back. And he made the prediction at that point, the NATO expanders will essentially say, look, the Russians are always been imperialists. That's just how they are. And he was making the point that it's flawed.
By the way, you remember Trump's rare earth deal that he signed with Ukraine? That's in the regions currently under Russian control, is where these rare earths are. That deal is never happening.
They will respond to what we're doing now. That was his main argument. I feel now it's the same thing. That is the Baltic states, for the past 4 years, been saying, the Russians might march on, Paris, or, after done with Ukraine, they'll invade Latvia. I always made a point that...
No. The areas that Russia does have an incentive to recover are the areas that historically have been part of Russia. Like Odessa was founded by Catherine the Great, the huge ethnic Russian population. There's a reason why 50 people were burned alive there by the Ukrainians when the Maidan coup happened is because there was protests against, breaking from Russia. Same thing. In these countries here, ethnic Russians are second-class citizens that can't vote, can't hold government office. These are, the EU pretends to be a democracy, but they literally have citizens of the EU that are second-class citizens. And these countries don't exist. They're just made up in the fall of Soviet Union. So this, and this half here. This is Ukraine, historic Ukraine. All the rest. So what Russia could potentially want to get the areas where there's ethnic Russians, they speak Russian, that they view as comrades, and take all of this. What you're left with is tiny Ukraine here, and I don't think they want to go into Poland at all.
That's ridiculous. No one in Russia wants to go into Latvia, but it doesn't look so ridiculous anymore. I don't think they want to.
Well, he's mad that the breakup of the Soviet Union made no sense. This area has been Russia for centuries, for millennia. Like, it's critical to Russia. Why it was just given to Ukraine because when the Soviet Union, for administrative purposes, just put this region together and called it Ukraine. But only this is historic Ukraine. Everything else, this is historic Russia. I'd be mad too if my country was cut up into small pieces so the West could loot it.
Like a mess, but I do think that they will strike it probably. I mean, I think we crossed that boundary as well. There's no coming back from this. Even if we stopped here and pulled back a bit, but we're going to continue to plow forward.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, which one of the republic is it? Estonia that has the large Russian population, or Latvia?
They both have about a significant, I think 20% or this is those countries, but they also have the strictest laws where the ethnic Russians or Russian speakers, they can't hold a government office, they don't get the voting rights, so they're kind of second-rate citizens. And the whole argument when they were joining NATO and the EU in 2004 was, Russia should be happy because the EU and NATO stands for human rights, so now the Russians should be reassured that the Russian minority will get rights. But
they never got rights.
Again, we're now 22 years later. There's nothing has been done. They don't.
Can you? I did not know this. There are people that are second-class citizens that can't vote and can't hold government office in these countries. These aren't democracies.
Yeah. So, no, I think. Well, there's a higher concentration, I think, in a specific region in Estonia. So if they would at Narva, but yeah.
I just think that, they should study the history of the special military operation and understand the difference between Rossia and Rosain, and between Slavic Russian people and the Russian nation, and understand that in Estonia, it's both Rosain and Rossia, and you're playing with fire. I mean, you're giving the Russians the excuse to do something that otherwise they wouldn't do.
Yeah, 20% of your country being Russian isn't a lot, but still a considerable chunk of your population. But for Russia, it's having those 20% be like second-class citizen. That's provocative in of itself. It's a reason it's justification to take that country and protect those 20%.
Yeah, I'm
_crusher.
I'm nervous. I don't know about you. I'm a little nervous. I don't want to test Karagonov's thesis. I don't want to test it because...
very classical Ukraine is, this part over here. We looked at historical graphs yesterday. Let's see, map, Ukraine. Russian Empire. There we go. See, it included Poland and all this part of the coast.
I know the outcome. I believe Karagonov's...
I just know that Odessa was founded by Catherine the Great, and this part here is heavily ethnic Russian, and this part here is mixed Ukraine Russian, and this is heavily Ukrainian. And there are other populations here, but there are mixed populations of ethnic Russians in this region. Poland's pretty much all Polish.
Right. That the United States will not sacrifice Boston or New York for Poznan or another city. But the United States can't allow Russia to create a new paradigm of nuclear deterrence where you have one power not only possessing nuclear weapons, but having demonstrated the capacity to use nuclear weapons. The other power can't sit there passively and to be the same way. They must use nuclear weapons too. And then the United States now has carte blanche to use nuclear weapons against Iran. and we will, because the precedent's been set by Russia. And once we begin these exchanges, it doesn't stop until there's a general exchange and we're all dead.
That is one thing that is scary. If nuclear weapons are used anywhere, then they become likely used everywhere. Like Israel will nuke Iran if somehow nukes are used in Europe. And if nukes are used against Iran, then Russia becomes more likely to use them in Europe. That is, the world becomes scarier as soon as nukes become used.
Is the flaw, I call it the fallacy, the Karaganov fallacy. I don't want to test it. I mean, Sergei Karaganov is a man I respect. I'm sure you respect him as well. His intellectual capacity is prodigious and somewhat intimidating sometimes. So, I mean,
remember when the surprise attack against Russia's strategic bombers that Mi-6 did, of using Ukraine as an excuse? I mean, Russia has had huge restraint in terms of not hitting back and not using nukes, to constant provocation from the West. And you don't read about explosions happening in Europe and drones flying out and hitting U.S. strategic bombers in the United States. Russia hasn't retaliated for the sabotage the West is doing. And I credit that to Putin. I think someone else might have, if it was Scott Ritter, he would have done something already.
I don't want to claim that I'm smarter than he is, but on the issue of nuclear war, nuclear weapons, I am experienced. And my gut feeling, and as an experienced analyst, you sort of go with your gut feeling on occasion, is that there's no containing nuclear weapons once they're used. Once they're used, whether it takes months, years, a decade.
Russia would be absolutely crushed against Poland, maybe even forced. Russia isn't going to try to invade Poland because Russia is functioning right now as a democracy. It does not want... you'd have to either make Polish citizens second-class citizens that can't vote in Russia, or you'd have to give them the right to vote, and it'd be a mess. Russia doesn't want Poland. It might bomb the hell out of Poland. That's possible if things escalate, but I don't think there's any chance of Russia invading Poland. I just don't.
Eventually, we're going to have a general nuclear exchange that takes out all of humanity, and I'd prefer that not to happen.
We are on the side, I guess, Russia. Yeah, historically, it's Ukraine is the one. Yeah, if you know the history, that's the problem. And it's actually today, Ukraine isn't really even topic. You have Europe making drones and sending them deep into Russia to hit targets. Ukraine is just used as a launching pad. You basically already have war between Europe and Russia, and we're discussing mostly Russia striking back against Europe. So yes, Ukraine is a participant to this, but Ukraine is busy losing the war. If you look at any type of maps of what's going on with the conflict, it's nearing the end in Ukraine. Yeah. 80% of Russians support Putin. You don't, if you're believing the West that Putin's leading an unpopular war, that is not true. Putin is the moderate. If you kill him, then Russia becomes more aggressive. Putin's support. It's between 70 and 80%. Russia is functioning as a democracy. It's respecting the will of its people. And it went into Ukraine because Ukraine was getting ready, had amassed 200,000 troops trained by United States and Europe to go in and brutally suppress the ethnic Russians in this region, in Donbass. And Russia didn't want to allow this, and so it went in. It also didn't want Ukraine to become part of NATO because then Ukraine could brutally suppress the people here without Russia being able to interfere, without triggering wider war. So they went in. They went in to protect the people that they view as Russian in this section of Ukraine. And there's no way they could allow it. And that was widely supported in Russia. It's not like Putin's doing this to get territory. It's not, Russia isn't Israel, where it's just trying to grab land all over the place. It was to protect the people there. Israel wants to take land, destroy everything in that land, and then put its own people there. No, Russia already has Russians in those land.
Which means I prefer no Russian conventional strikes. I prefer peace. I prefer sanity. But the West is is basically punted on that.
Yeah, and I also make that point as well. What's going to kill us all is the delusion of escalation control. Once do what we're doing now, the belief that, well, we can just escalate a little bit more. If the Russians don't care for it, maybe we'll take a little step back and then push forward again. It's I think this is the dangerous delusion. We're going to lose very quickly control over this, and that should be the lesson of Iran as well. By the way, that you can't go back to status quo essentially.
Marco Rubio needs to learn that lesson. But because he said, I wish we'd go back to this. Barbara Tuchman's book, was it March of Folly that she wrote, or August? I think March of Folly, about basically the summer of 1914. Nobody believed it. They all believed it was capable, that it wasn't. That you just had a little conflict with Serbia. It wasn't going to be a big deal. Don't worry about it. Next thing you know, you have a world war. It just got out of control. And I think that's where we're at right now. I mean, Trump's in desperate. One of the problems we have here is that Trump is not a rational actor.
Yeah, Trump is. Yeah, I can't trust Trump anymore. Like betraying Massey, that was. Oh my God, that really hurt. I can't trust Trump at all anymore.
And he's already been humiliated by Iran. Can he really withstand another humiliation?
I mean, there are people in Europe right now that are openly talking about sacrificing Ukraine to weaken the Russians, so that when Europe goes to war with Russia, they'll have a better advantage. I mean, they're not even talking about. There's no talk about the Ukrainians joining the EU anymore. They're sacrificial lamb to weaken Russia.
Again, these are theses I don't want tested. I don't want to test these. But unfortunately, I think we're going to test them.
Mm-hmm.
Well, so you assume it's very likely, if not guaranteed now, that the Russians will retaliate. How do you see them going up this escalation ladder? Will they go with incrementalism or go in hard essentially?
Here we go. This one, actually, this is the video I'm thinking of. It's not available anymore, damn it.
Because, they could do something from plausible deniability, that is sending in Ukrainian drones. They're essentially down before. They can do a conventional strike. I mean, they can do I don't think a tactical nuke is, that would be far, far up the escalation ladder. But how do you see them retaliating, or what would you expect? I mean, there's no Russian playbook, as people say, so it's not necessarily one thing that's true. But what do you think might be possible escalation strategies?
I believe that I have to take off my military hat, because my military hat says, if you're going to do this, do it decisively. I do believe that Putin will allow for escalation management, but the initial blows will be dismissed. I think that Kiev will be eliminated, and Bankova, and I believe that a Baltic state will be struck decisively. You hear the rhetoric. The decision-making centers have already been identified. So I believe that an example will be set of a Baltic state, a decisive example. And then I think there will be, very little wiggle room, meaning that zero tolerance for Western retaliation. Any effort at Western retaliation will bring the full weight of a Russian military response. But I do believe that, I don't believe German factories are going to be hit in the first wave. I don't believe, UK factories. I think that will be left for, follow-on wave if necessary. But I do think that Russia will have to put a marker down, and that it won't be just one or two attacks. I think if they hit a Baltic state, they will eliminate the Baltic state, because you have to send a signal. You have to say, there before the grace of God go you. This is the future of Germany.
So that's what we're looking forward to after Putin gets back from China and before the St. Petersburg Economic Forum begins, is something like this. Yeah.
And I do think that it's time for Oreshnik to be unveiled in all of its awful, horrific reality. No single attacks anymore. Concentrated Oreshnik attacks, the way the weapon was designed to create nuclear-type devastation in the urban area. And the West needs to see this.
It's so incredibly depressing. Do you think there's any possibility now that we're kind of reached a point where we're likely going into a direct war with Russia, or Russia will at least retaliate in a big way? Do you think there's any possibility for a diplomatic path? I mean, what do you make of what the EU is doing now? Because, they're discussing, should we talk to the Russians? Who should talk to the Russians? What should we talk about? What do you make of this?
I don't see any hope in the East.
There's no hope. The globalists are in charge right now. Unpopular. They don't have the support of their people and are more or less U.S. puppets of the U.S. deep state. And yeah, there's no hope for anything from them.
EU in the short term maturing to the level.
The alternative parties like the AfD their support has to grow for them, and they have to be elected. And that can't happen overnight.
Necessary for diplomatic intervention to be meaningful at this stage, because at the same time they're speaking of diplomatic intervention, their militaries are talking about war. You need to shut down the war. I do believe that China provides a very important diplomatic possibility. That China, after Putin leaves, China will be able to contact Trump because there is connectivity there, and China will be able to contact the European Union and put them on notice that this isn't a bluff. This is the real deal. You have no choice but to change the way you're going, or else the consequences will be devastating. So I do think there's still a window of opportunity, but the United States needs something to jump kick it. And right now we don't have effective one-on-one with Putin. I think if China intervenes, then Trump may call Putin. Putin may call Trump, and pressure could be placed on Europe. And I'm hoping that that's the case. I'm hoping the United States puts Europe on notice that if they continue down this path, the United States will not be there for them. That this is their problem and they need to stop this right now. And the United States also needs to basically tell Ukraine, it's over, it's finished, you're done. Whether Trump can do that, like I said,
if Trump unleashes a thermonuclear war with Russia to defend Ukraine and the Baltic states, that is America last.
In one Iran, maybe he'd have some political capital to spend, but he's a very weakened man. I don't see him being able to take two defeats at once. But the smart thing to do would be to stop this path towards war, because that's what we're on. We're literally on a path towards the kind of war that I trained to fight as a young Marine. I mean, this is the war I trained to fight, and so I'm fully aware of what this kind of war means and what the consequences are if we ever cross that line of departure. Nobody in the military today, unfortunately, they've all aged out. My generation is done. But we don't have, if there's any, we don't have any real Cold Warriors left. So they don't know what the Cold War was. They don't know what the Soviet Union was. They don't know what it was like to be prepared to, fight large-scale ground combat in Europe that involved nuclear weapons. We're getting ready to.
Yeah, it's a very scary situation. Well, I'm going to leave it at that. And so this week, there's a good chance that Russia is going to strike Europe. What will happen next? We'll see. This will be on YouTube. Like and subscribe. Come watch on Kick or Twitch. And I'll see you next video. Bye.